My 4-year-old grandson grabbed my sleeve right as I was reaching for the pen. He was looking up at me with his mother's eyes, dark brown, serious in a way that no 4-year-old's eyes should be, and his small hand was wrapped around my wrist the way children grab things when they mean it. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "I need to show you something on the tablet." The dining room at Cedar Ridge held 12 people that evening. My attorney Kenneth, 3 of my longest business partners, my brother Dale, my daughter Lauren and her husband Brett, and Monica, sitting at the far end of the table in a jade green dress, smiling at something one of the wives had said. The documents in front of me were 2 pages. My signature at the bottom would give Monica a 30% ownership stake in Harwell Construction and add her name to the deed of the home I had built with my own hands 40 years ago. I looked at my grandson. He was still holding up a tablet with both hands, the way children offer something they consider important. I took it from him without a word. "I want to tell you what I saw on that screen. But first I need to tell you who I am and what I had already lost before Monica ever walked into my life, because the shape of a man's vulnerability matters. It tells you where the cracks are, and there are people in this world who know exactly how to find them. I built Harwell Construction in Asheville, North Carolina, starting in 1987 with $12,000, a used pickup truck, and a handshake from a man named Ezra who believed in me before I believed in myself. We built houses, then commercial buildings, then the kind of large-scale residential developments that people in western North Carolina had driven to Charlotte for before we existed. By the time I turned 60, Harwell had 300 employees and a reputation I guarded the way I guarded everything I had ever built. Carefully, and with the understanding that it had taken a long time to earn and could be lost much faster than that. My wife Catherine built it with me. That is the thing people sometimes forget about a man's success, who was standing beside him when the numbers didn't work and the bank was sending letters. And the question wasn't whether to quit, but whether to sell the truck first or the equipment. Catherine was a bookkeeper when we met. She had red hair and a pencil tucked behind her ear and a laugh that made you feel like whatever room you were in was exactly where you were supposed to be. She kept the books for Harwell for 22 years before we were big enough to bring in a CFO. She raised our daughter Lauren through those same years. She planted the garden at Cedar Ridge when Lauren turned 9, and she tended that garden for 26 years. She died on a Thursday morning in March, 14 months before the dinner I just described. A brain aneurysm. Fast. I was in a meeting in Hendersonville and my daughter called, and I drove home on roads I don't remember. And I walked into the hospital, and a doctor told me in a corridor that my wife of 38 years was gone. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 2 hours before I could figure out how to drive. Lauren handled the arrangements because I was not capable. I have never been less capable of anything in my life than I was in those first 6 months. The house was too quiet in a way I could not explain to anyone who hadn't felt it. 40 years of someone's presence doesn't disappear when they do. It stays in everything. The coffee mug she always used, the way she arranged the kitchen towels, the sound the screen door made when she came in from the garden. The silence after is not empty. It's full of everything that isn't there anymore. That was the man who walked into a charity golf tournament in September, 7 months after Catherine died, and met Monica. She was co-chairing the event, which benefited a children's literacy foundation in Asheville. She was 51, polished and composed, originally from Charlotte. She had dark hair she wore straight and a quality of stillness I found calming after months of my own internal noise. She had lost a partner 2 years before, she said, a man she'd been with for several years. She didn't linger on it. She had come to Asheville for a fresh start. We talked for an hour at the reception. She asked about Harwell with what seemed like genuine curiosity. She had opinions about development in western North Carolina that were informed and specific. She didn't try too hard. That was what I noticed most. She had the ease of someone who wasn't performing. I told myself I was evaluating things too closely because loss had made me suspicious. I called her a week later, told myself I was being polite. By February, she had been to Cedar Ridge 3 times. My brother Dale called her sharp. Lauren smiled and said the right things when I asked her opinion. My office manager, Pearl, who had worked at Harwell for 20 years and had known Catherine for most of them, said very little when Monica came up in conversation. I noticed Pearl's silence. I filed it away under things I was choosing not to examine. That was my first mistake. Pearl's silences were never accidental. Pearl has worked for Harwell Construction since I hired her as office administrator in 2003, a month after our previous office manager retired. Catherine hired her after a 30-minute conversation, which was fast for Catherine. When I asked about it that evening, she said, "That woman has been watching people her whole life. She sees what's underneath." 2 decades later, I understand what Catherine recognized. Pearl was not simply an office manager. She was the institutional memory of everything Harwell had ever done and everyone who had ever passed through its doors. She started watching Monica in November. She told me about it months later, sitting in my office with her hands folded and her voice steady, having rehearsed the right order. The first thing she noticed was the questions. Monica asked them pleasantly, always in conversation, the way someone asks out of curiosity, rather than because they're mapping territory. But Pearl noticed the questions circled back every time. Who had signatory authority on the Harwell accounts? Was there a formal board, or did I hold sole control of the LLC? What happened to the business if something happened to me? She asked the bookkeeper about our insurance carriers. She asked the site supervisor about equipment valuations. She asked these things over coffee with the warm interest of a woman learning the world her future husband lived in. Nobody felt interrogated. That, Pearl told me, was the craft of it. The second thing Pearl noticed was what was happening to my daughter. Lauren is 32 years old, and she has her mother's precision with numbers and my stubbornness, and a mind I have watched work through problems since she was small. She earned her CPA license at 26 and built a client roster at an Asheville firm that her supervisors called exceptional. She met Brett at a conference in Charlotte when she was 28. They married the following year. My grandson arrived when Lauren was 30. I want to be honest about Brett, because honesty is the only way this makes sense. He was not obviously wrong. He was 37, a project manager at a mid-sized development company, confident and presentable and good with people in the surface way that some people are good with people. He had a firm handshake and told stories well. Catherine, in the quiet way she registered thoughts without pushing them, once said she found him difficult to read. She said it once and did not say it again. I did not tend that observation the way I should have. Lauren left her accounting firm in March, the same month Catherine died, on indefinite leave. Brett thought it was better, she told me, for her to be home with their son while they figured out next steps. Her voice on the phone had a quality I didn't recognize at first. Careful, measured in a way Lauren had never been with me before, like someone reading from a list of approved responses. I told myself it was grief. She had just lost her mother. I gave her the space I thought she needed. Pearl saw what I didn't. She told me later what she observed when Brett came by the Harwell office, which happened with increasing frequency through the fall, always when I was out at job sites or in meetings across town. He had conversations with our longest subcontractors that Pearl couldn't always hear directly, but could read the shape of through the office glass. She wrote down what she could in a small green notebook she kept in the top drawer of her desk. She had been keeping that notebook since November. I asked her later why she hadn't come to me sooner. She looked at me with those steady brown eyes of hers and said what I already understood before she said it. "Mr. James, I've worked for enough people in this business to know that when the office manager tells her employer his girlfriend's no good, the office manager tends to lose the job. I needed something solid before I came to you." She was right, and knowing she was right sat in my chest like a stone, because it meant the very structure I had built. The trust, the hierarchy, the way this company ran, had become one of the walls keeping the truth away from me. She set the green notebook on the desk between us. It was completely full. Some things sit too close to the bone for the right words. Kenneth had been my attorney and closest friend for 30 years. We met at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast in 1994 and realized inside 20 minutes that we had grown up 40 miles apart, in the same part of the state, and had both, independently, spent our 20s making the same mistakes. He answered the phone on the second ring, always. He listened without interrupting. He was the kind of friend who didn't need to see you every month to remain solid. It was Kenneth who confirmed the Raleigh connection. Pearl's nephew worked in commercial lending at a bank in Raleigh. In February, Pearl mentioned Monica's name to him during a Sunday family dinner, the way you mention things you're carrying and haven't quite named yet. Her nephew went quiet. He told her he'd heard that name before, in the context of a situation at his bank that had made people uncomfortable. He couldn't share details, but he told Pearl to look up the public court records in Wake County from 3 years prior. Pearl went to the Buncombe County Courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon and used the public access terminal. The filing was civil fraud, a retired general contractor from Raleigh. A man who had built a solid regional business over 30 years had been in a relationship with a woman named Monica. He had added her name to his home deed and granted her co-management authority over his business accounts. Over the following 8 months, $460,000 moved out of those accounts in increments calibrated carefully enough that no automatic bank alert was triggered. When he discovered what had happened and ended the relationship, she contested the deed. The case settled out of court. He sold the house to cover the settlement and the legal fees. His business closed the following year. Pearl photographed every page. She called Kenneth first. She had the instinct to go to the attorney before coming to me, to have someone else read it who would understand its weight before it landed on the one person who had the most to lose from it. Kenneth called me that same evening and said he needed to come by. His voice had the particular register he used when something required sitting down. He laid the photographs across my kitchen table, and I read them twice without speaking. Then I sat back and looked out the window at the garden Catherine had planted, dark in the February night, and I stayed very still for a long time. I thought about the documents waiting to be signed, about the 30% of Harwell construction I had been planning to transfer to Monica as a gesture of commitment before we married, about what 30% of Harwell was worth, everything I had built since I was 26 years old, and what a person could do with co-management authority over accounts I had spent 4 decades building. I thought about Lauren, about the careful voice, about the way she sometimes hesitated before answering a simple question, as though she was calculating the safe response. I thought about my grandson, 4 years old, who spent his time at Cedar Ridge running the back hallway in his socks, and asking me questions about construction equipment with the relentless curiosity of a child for whom the world is still completely interesting. I did not sleep that night. Kenneth and Pearl came back to Cedar Ridge 2 evenings before the dinner. We sat in the study, the room where I had signed every significant document in the 40-year history of Harwell, and went through everything. Pearl read from the green notebook. 22 weeks of dates and observations and overheard conversations, logged with the precision of someone who understood. That precision was not pedantry, but protection. Kenneth laid out the legal exposure, what the deed transfer would have meant, how long unwinding it could take through the North Carolina courts, what that process would cost in time and money, and the kind of uncertainty that makes running a business nearly impossible. Then he told me what he had confirmed from 2 of my subcontractors, who Brett had approached the previous fall. Brett had represented himself as acting with my authority. He had arranged credit extensions totaling $90,000 in Harwell's name across 3 vendors. He had told each of them I was aware and had approved the arrangements. I had not known any of it existed. I sat in that room and felt the full weight of all of it together for the first time. Each piece had been serious on its own. Together they were something else entirely. Together they were a portrait of 2 people who had found each other, recognized what the other was doing, and decided that what I had built was the most efficient path to what they both wanted. I told Kenneth and Pearl what I needed from them at the dinner. Kenneth asked 2 clarifying questions about timing. Pearl asked whether I wanted her to read from the notebook directly or give a summary. I told her to read directly. She nodded once and clipped the relevant pages with small paper clips and put the notebook in her bag. At the dinner I played the role required of me. I was warm and present and entirely unhurried, in the way that is only possible for a man who has already made his peace with what the evening requires. I poured wine. I spoke with business partners I had known for decades, men I had quietly contacted in the prior week, who understood why they had been invited and what their presence meant. Monica sat at the end of the table and was everything she always was, warm, considered, precisely calibrated to the room. Brett sat beside Lauren with his hand on the back of her chair and laughed at the right moments. Lauren ate slowly and said the appropriate things to the people beside her. Every time the table's attention shifted elsewhere, she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had been holding herself together through sheer discipline for a very long time, and was waiting for something and wasn't sure yet whether what she was waiting for was going to come. Then my grandson came to me with the tablet. He had found Monica's phone on the kitchen counter while the adults were still settling in. He was 4, and he had pressed the large red button the way 4-year-olds press every button available to them. The phone had been mid-recording. Monica had been leaving herself a voice memo, the kind of running notes a person makes when they are tracking the progress of something they are managing carefully. The recording continued for 6 minutes after he pressed it. He had listened to some of it with the concentration of a small child trying to understand adult things, and then he had come to find me because he had heard my name, and he knew that things with his name in them were supposed to go to him. The recording was clear. 3.5 minutes of Monica speaking through what she expected the evening to accomplish, the timeline for the account access once the deed transfer had time to settle, and 2 mentions of Brett in a context that made their coordination with each other unmistakable. Toward the end, the phrase, "By the time he understands what's happened, it'll be too late to matter." I held the tablet. I was crouched at my grandson's level, and he was watching me with his mother's eyes, patient in the way children are patient when they have done something they feel good about and are waiting for confirmation. I asked if he had shown the phone to anyone else. He shook his head. I told him he had done something important. I held him for a moment with his small arms around my neck. He smelled like the cedar soap Lauren used for his bath. Then I stood up. I looked at Kenneth across the table. I gave him the smallest possible nod. He reached into his jacket and set the photographed court documents from Wake County on the table beside his plate, and said, quietly and without preface, that before we proceeded with the signing, there was something the group needed to hear. What followed lasted 23 minutes. Kenneth spoke first, presenting the Raleigh civil filing, the name, the mechanism, the amounts, the outcome. He was a lawyer and he did not editorialize. He stated facts in sequence. Pearl read from the green notebook after him. Every question Monica had asked about the Harwell accounts, every conversation about the deed, every time the expression on Monica's face changed the moment my back was turned. She read without commentary or emphasis. She read the way someone reads who has been precise about things for 20 years and knows that precision is its own form of argument. The 2 subcontractors Brett had defrauded confirmed, in turn, what he had told them and what he had claimed about my involvement. Monica did not speak during any of it. She sat with her wine glass in front of her and her face moved through several versions of itself. Something that wanted to look like confusion, then something colder, before settling into a stillness that told me the real calculation was happening somewhere behind her eyes, the rapid assessment of someone measuring a position and deciding whether it can still be held. Brett stood up twice. Both times Kenneth said the name of the attorney who had already been retained on behalf of the defrauded vendors, and both times Brett sat back down. At the end of it, the room was the quietest a room full of people can be. I looked at Monica, and I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because honesty is the only reason I am telling this story at all. I did not feel anger first. I felt something quieter than anger and harder to name. The particular sorrow of a man who had confused the comfort of company with the fact of love, who had spent 14 months so hungry for someone to sit beside in the morning, that he had looked in the wrong direction and kept looking even when the light wasn't quite right. I had not been foolish in the way people usually mean when they say that word. I had been wounded, and someone had studied where the wound was, and I had let them close enough to use it. That is a different kind of mistake. It cost me more to forgive myself for it than for anything else in this story. Monica and Brett left Cedar Ridge that night through the side door. Pearl noted the time in her notebook, 9:51 p.m., because Pearl noted everything, and because she understood that records matter most after the fact, and they did. Lauren stayed. After the other guests left, after Kenneth and Pearl had gone, and the house was quiet, my daughter and I sat in the kitchen together. My grandson was asleep on the couch in the back room, under the quilt Catherine had made the winter before she got sick. We could hear him breathing if we were still enough. Lauren told me what the 2 years with Brett had actually been. She took her time. She told me about the friction he manufactured whenever she made plans with friends, not forbidding her, never forbidding her, just going quiet and withdrawn in a way that required attention and repair, so that over months the cost of making plans became more than the plans were worth. She told me about the morning he took her keys and explained, gently and with apparent concern, that she hadn't been well and he didn't want her driving alone. She told me about the letter she wrote me last spring, that she dropped in the mailbox at the end of the driveway herself, that I never received. I kept my hand over hers on the table while she talked. He told me it would break you if I said anything, she said, when she had said everything else. He said you had already been through enough losing Mom, and that you'd finally started to come back to yourself, and that I would be the one who knocked it all back down again. She exhaled slowly, the way you exhale when you've been holding something for a long time and have just set it on the ground. I believed that for longer than I should have. That's the part I keep sitting with. I want to say something about that clearly because it matters. My daughter did not stay silent because she was weak. She stayed silent because they had found the exact thing she loved enough to be afraid of, her father's peace, and used it as a lock on the door. That is a more sophisticated cruelty than a lock on a door. It leaves no marks. And it is the most carefully designed thing they did, because they understood that the person most able to help her was also the lever they needed to keep her from asking. She had stayed methodical and careful, and she'd kept her son safe, and she had waited for a moment that felt survivable. Those are not the actions of someone who gave up. Those are the actions of someone who was paying attention the whole time. I told her that. She looked at her hands. Then she said, Mom would have seen through Brett in a week. I almost laughed before I actually did. A real one, the kind that comes up from somewhere genuine and surprises you on the way out. 3 days, I said, and she would have found a way to make him figure it out himself. Lauren laughed too, briefly. Then she was crying, quietly, and I put my arm around her, and she leaned her head against my shoulder the way she had when she was 6 years old. We sat like that in the kitchen that Catherine had cooked in for 30 years, in the house I had built by hand, while my grandson slept in the next room. Outside, the February night lay across the garden, cold and still and without judgment, the way the natural world continues, regardless of what people have done inside. 3 days after the dinner, I promoted Pearl to Director of Operations at Harwell Construction. I gave her a salary she should have had 5 years earlier, a company vehicle, and an office with her name on the door. She accepted the first 2 without comment. When I told her about the office, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had always preferred the desk with the window that faced east, if that was all right with me. I told her it was her company too. She nodded once and went back to work. The legal process that followed took time. The courts in North Carolina move on their own schedule and for good reason. Restitution from Brett to the defrauded vendors was ordered 9 months later. Kenneth handled it all with the unhurried precision of a man who had been keeping my affairs straight for 3 decades, and I was glad to leave it in his hands. Lauren filed for divorce in March. She moved into the guest suite at Cedar Ridge with my grandson, while the proceedings ran their course. By summer, she was in her own apartment, 10 minutes from the house, had taken on 2 accounting clients, and was in conversation with the firm in Asheville, whose principal called me in April to ask whether she was coming back. I told him she would, in her own time, and that when she did, she would be exactly the person she had always been. He said he was glad to hear it. On a Saturday morning in May, I sat on the back porch, with my coffee and the mountain light coming down through the trees the way it does in Asheville in the spring. Bright and new, the kind of light that doesn't argue with anything. The garden was coming back from winter. Lauren had been out there the weekend before with my grandson, who had decided he was personally responsible for the strawberry plants, and had appointed himself their official guardian and protector. I thought about Catherine. I do that still, every morning. Not with the weight I carried in those first months after she died, but with the quality of conversation you have with someone who is gone but not absent. She would not have been surprised by any part of what happened. She had seen Brett clearly in a single dinner 3 years ago, and said what she saw in the quiet way she had. And I had not grown what she planted fast enough. She would not have blamed me for that. She was never the kind of woman who needed to be right more than she needed me to be okay. What I think she would have said was what she always said when I brought something hard home from the work and couldn't find the end of it. You already know what to do. You've always known. The only question is whether you're going to let fear make the decision instead of you. I had been afraid in those months before the dinner of going back to the silence, of returning to a house where no one knew which drawer I kept things in, or how I took my coffee, or what I looked like on an ordinary morning before I'd put myself together. Monica had offered an exit from that. I had taken it because the ache of an empty house is real, in a way that is difficult to convey to someone who has not felt it, and there are people who study that ache the way an engineer studies a structure, not to strengthen it, but to find the fastest path through. I know that now. I know it in a way I could not have before. I also know other things. I know that loyalty does not announce itself. It shows up quietly, year after year, in green notebooks and logged timestamps and a nephew's word at a Sunday dinner and a friend who answers the phone before the second ring completes. I know that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who tell you the truth, before it's convenient for them to tell it. And I know this. A 4-year-old boy pressed a button on a phone he wasn't supposed to touch, walked across a crowded dining room, and handed his grandfather something he didn't understand, and that simple and unremarkable act of trust changed the course of everything for everyone in that house. He doesn't know that. He knows he found a perfect feather in the garden last week, and has decided it belongs to an eagle, and he knows his mother is happy now, and he knows his grandfather takes him to the diner on Friday mornings for pancakes, and he knows that Cedar Ridge is the place where he is most completely, most unreservedly himself. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is the thing no signature on any document could ever have taken from us. It was there the whole time, solid underneath everything that had been built on top of it. The way a foundation holds a house, even when you can't see it working, even when someone has spent 2 years trying to convince you the house is theirs. I finished my coffee. I went inside. The morning was getting on, and there was work to do, and I was glad for it.